So my name is Mike Trombley. I am an instructional designer at UNE, and this presentation is about evaluation and rubrics and how you can make the most of them. So a couple topics that I want to discuss today. I have a few tips to share on these topics, but I also want to sort of listen to each of you and hear what you have to say and what experiences you have had. So the first topic is, what should I do when my feedback doesn't fit into the rubric categories? I know I've experienced this feeling myself and have often wondered what to do. So we have a couple of ideas and also would like to hear what you folks think. When and where should I send suggestions for improving a rubric? So that's actually one of the outcomes sometimes when your feedback doesn't fit into a rubric. It might mean that the rubric isn't working as well as it should, and we can fix it. How can I give students enough feedback without spending an hour or some, unsustainable amount of time grading just a single student's assignment? When could I use video feedback, and why might I use video feedback? And then at the end, we will open it up for some general questions and answers. Before we jump into those topics, though, I wonder if we can share sort of our feelings about these questions. What's your experience been with rubrics? Do you find them helpful? Is any aspect of them challenging to you or frustrating? And how do your students react to them? So, Ivan, do you have any thoughts on these questions?
There's one part of the rubric that I struggle with all the time, and that's the rubric that deals with the response from a student. In other words, when a student is responding to another student's rubric, the rubrics really don't give me a lot to work with there. Did they ask a question? One thing I comment back to them quite a bit is that if they ask a question, it tends to extend the conversation, but on the other hand, discussions are not really designed to have extensive discussions. So that's one part of the rubric that I struggle with quite often is the response one.
Okay.
One that I think we fixed, which was a problem for a while there, was how I deal with the exceptional response. How do I differentiate that from everybody else's response? And now we've really solved that with exemplary. I don't get as many questions. I used to get a lot of questions. Why didn't I get 3 out of 3 or 10 out of 10 or something like that? How come I got marked off? And I try to respond to them that you did an excellent job, but you just, it's how do you explain subjective grading? And that's the problem. So I solved that problem, but the one on responses I still struggle with.
Okay. So yeah, we will talk a little bit about what some ideas of fixing that might be. But that's a really good point. If a rubric category, or if a criterion is too vague or doesn't really explain fully what the expectation is, it's hard to hold students up to that expectation. So the first one we'll talk about is, what should I do when my feedback doesn't fit into rubric categories? And my thoughts on this are, if you receive a response from a student that isn't really ready to be graded, then you don't need to grade it yet. And when might that be? If there are significant lapses in quality in the paper, like if it's a paper or a project, you receive it and it's not meeting base expectations that are sort of implied. So professional writing, right? Something, elaboration on points or arguments. If those aren't explicitly stated in the rubric, they don't necessarily have to be, but it's sort of the expectation we have of graduate students. And if they're not meeting those expectations, just send it back. Maybe give a little bit of feedback to a student saying, this isn't quite ready yet. I want you to take a second shot, or I want you to address these certain aspects of the assignment that weren't fully explained, but we do hope everybody adheres to. And that might involve going to the writing center. It might involve a quick, one-on-one session with a student, between the student and the instructor. It depends, but it's something we would encourage folks, instructors, to do. If the issues are minor, though, then we could use the general feedback field at the bottom of the evaluation page, where that's not necessarily attached to specific rubric categories, but you could use that field to explain why you might have taken some points off, or to explain why next time you turn in a similar assignment, like a discussion, you expect students to ask more questions, or to keep the conversation going, or something along those lines. So if the rubric, though, is not addressing a criterion that you think it should, or it's too vague. So Ivan, you mentioned the response category, what is it about it that you think is not really explaining enough? Is it just sort of the rubrics that you're thinking of? Do they just say student responds to 2 others or something like that?
Usually in the assignment, it says respond to 1 other student.
Yeah.
2 others, usually one other student. And many times I get responses that say, this is a really good post, thank you.
Yep. Okay.
That doesn't do anything, okay?
Right.
What I'm looking for in a response is to take the person's response apart. Well, you got into this issue by saying such and such, say it's my occupational health class. You got into a discussion in your post about OSHA, but did you really know that OSHA has this and this and this? Or I might suggest that you look at this post, or how does this injury develop in the work? Something that gets back to the person that posted that you'd like some more information.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of is it. Otherwise, why bother responding? I mean, it's nice to say that they enjoy the post, but that's not what we're looking for here. If you're in a classroom setting and somebody gave a presentation or presented something, you would hope that students in the class would question it or do something with it.
Yeah.
Trying to simulate in these discussions. The rubric really doesn't get to that at all. In one sense, it doesn't get to it.
Now, have you in the past suggested, revising it to better address that issue?
I have. I'm trying to remember whether I did or I really haven't. I can't.
Okay.
I can't say I have.
So what we suggest in those, and that's an excellent point about. It really sounds like expectations are just not clear enough for students there, both in the prompt itself as well as the rubric. And so what we would recommend, and this carries a lot of weight coming from an instructor, is to use the contact IDS form that's in the course, and it brings you to a page where you select revision for future term.
Okay.
And if you select that, it asks you a few questions about what your suggestion is. So you could say something about how the rubric and the discussion posts need to specify in greater detail what students should be doing in a response. And then when you send it, it goes not just to IDS, but more importantly, the program, where they can take a look at it in the context of the course and evaluations and other feedback they've had, and decide whether they want to assign somebody to make that edit to the course in the future. And with GPH specifically, that's an interesting one, because every rubric for every discussion in that course is different. So it could even be something, we could try out in just one course rather than rolling it out to in other programs, there's the same rubric for every single course and every single discussion. So it could be a good pilot.
Okay, well, I will definitely take that suggestion.
Great.
Next time I'm asked to teach a class, I'll take a look at the rubric and see if it's something that needs revision. Okay.
And this one is something that I think a lot of people struggle with. When I teach courses, I struggle with this. It's, how do you balance thorough feedback with, efficiency? And how do you make sure that you're able to give, if you've got a couple assignments a week that you're grading, how do you make sure you're not spending a lot of time on each evaluation session? And so the suggestion we have, a couple of suggestions we have for this, is to sort of find your groove, to get sort of into a routine where what works for you. but don't expect miracles. You know, it's still going to take some time to give people adequate feedback. You still have to read the discussions, right? And that's not something you want to rush too much. I like to take notes as I read students' work. So I have usually a separate notepad application open sort of to the side. And I could either, if it's a discussion, I can take notes in there and then later paste them into my feedback. If it is a assignment, you have the advantage of being able to use the annotations feature to make comments embedded right in the document. And so that's one that I use as much as possible when I'm reading a paper or some kind of like a Word doc that somebody's turned in.
Can I just stop you right there?
Yeah.
That is a problem. I asked the students to submit Word documents.
Okay.
And I correct the Word document, which gives me a place to put comments in.
Yeah.
I rarely use what Brightspace puts in the fill-in box, because I find those annotations are difficult to use.
So
But
let me,
if they send me a PDF, then I'm out of luck. I can't make any comments on a PDF. So I really require Word documents
okay, so are you making comments in Word as opposed to in this view right here in Brightspace?
Yes, I'm doing it right in Word.
Okay, gotcha.
And then I send it, I save that as the corrected version and I send that back to them.
Yep, okay. And have you tried this mode in Brightspace instead of using Word?
Yes, and it hasn't been, I haven't tried it recently, but when I first started using Brightspace, I found it to be cumbersome. I found that I was much more comfortable using Word and a review function in Word.
So this is the view I use most of the time when I give students feedback, because whether it's a doc or a PDF, I can do this. And
can you share that now? I don't see anything but you.
You don't see anything but me. I thought.
Oh, there we go. Now I see it.
You can see it now? Okay. So this is sort of a submission page. I'm going to discard here because this is just a sample. And so if a student submits a Word doc or a PDF, I can go in here and use all kinds of annotations like these little sticky notes. I can highlight. And then what I typically do is when I turn it back to the student, I'll say right over here, please see my embedded feedback in the Brightspace document.
So when they click on that, they see your doc,
They'll go through and they'll see these little icons that they can then look at.
Well, I haven't used it in such a long time. That is a little better view than I was used to. Now I can do this if a person submits a PDF.
Yes.
How do I open the PDF in this Brightspace space?
So let me go back here, discard again. A PDF should show up the same way, except instead of docx like it says here, it'll say PDF. Yeah. And then you can open it. And you can still highlight the same way you would, or you can insert these and it'll go right into the document.
So if I click on their document, it opens in that space. Okay.
Yep, it should, yeah.
We'll try that next time. I usually download. I click the download button.
Yeah, I have done some downloads in certain situations where it just makes a little bit more sense. But as much as possible, it saves me time to be able to look at it right here in the browser. And then I don't have to re-upload and do that sort of thing. But it depends. I mean, every situation, might be a little bit different.
Well, here's the question with the download.
Yep.
What happens if after the fact, this is a week 2 assignment, and maybe in week 3 or 4, the student questions my corrections. If I don't load a document and save it in my computer, I can't go back and see what I corrected. Can I?
Right. Well, it'll probably still be, if you sort of attach it to your feedback, like if you've done what you're talking about where you make edits right into a Word doc and you re-upload it, it should still be here in Brightspace because it was attached to the feedback from the beginning. Oh. But it's sort of an extra step for you to have to worry about. And that's one of the advantages of just doing it right here, is that you don't need to worry about re-uploading or anything like that.
But what if the student questions it? Can I go back to that?
To your annotations, like in here?
Yeah.
Yep, you sure can.
Oh, okay.
Yep, they're all saved. They're all saved right there. Yep.
All right, then I'll try it. I'll try it.
It works well for a lot of us. Finally, canned responses. So if you are, let's say you are, you teach a course a couple times, once a year or something like that, and you have a certain sort of response that keeps coming up. Students make sort of the same, they either make the same mistakes or they make the same, really good responses. You can absolutely reuse some of those, keep them in a document that you save to your desktop or to a folder, and reuse them when and where that's appropriate. Certainly we wouldn't want to overuse that, but it can, save yourself a little bit of time if you're reusing some feedback that's especially common. And then this might be the most important one. It's just to focus on what students really need to hear. You are not, or we are not, as instructors, we're not proofreaders for students. And so we don't need to feel we shouldn't feel the responsibility to identify every single missed comma or need for correction that might fall under the paper. We are trying to give them feedback based on how they performed according to this specific assignment. So I find that if I focus on that more than anything else, above anything else, it does go by a little bit quicker, and I'm able to not get too lost in details that are not what the student should be prioritizing. This is an example of what I do when I am grading assignments. I like to expand the full rubric and keep it over to the side. It helps me sort of think about what's coming up next and see everything all in one view rather than using the sliders that are in Brightspace. And then this is my simple notepad that I keep over on the left, where I might copy and paste a line that a student wrote that I could embed into my feedback, especially if it's a discussion. Oops. And that's also where I might keep a couple of comments that I might be reusing or adjusting later on.
You're opening 3 different applications here?
Yes.
Ed? Okay. I guess I got to review how to do that. That's a nice feature, because I'd like to use that. That is a nice feature. I think,
yeah, so I don't keep the browser in full screen, and that allows me to open a notepad on the side, just a basic text. I don't use something like Word. I'd use a really simple, this is just text edit on a Mac. I think Notepad is the similar app on Windows.
Yeah, Windows has Notepad.
Notepad, yep.
That's good. I'll give that a try.
Yeah, it's and then if you open the rubric, if you expand it into this mode, it automatically gives you sort of a pop-up view where you can see more of the rubric. I just like that. That's my personal approach to it. But this is what I meant earlier when I said find your groove. You sort of get a setup that works for you, that sort of lets you get what you need quickly without having to reach too far. And that can help quite a bit.
And so, Mike, can I just follow up on this? So you actually are using just 2 applications. You're using the Brightspace view of the submission, then
Yes.
you just open the rubric in a different window.
Yes.
And it's sort of within the same Brightspace, I guess, setup. And then the only thing using extra is that notepad where you take notes.
Yep. And let me demonstrate this real quick, actually. So here, if you have the rubric on the right, usually the default is to use the rubric this way. And I don't love this. It just feels a little squeezed to me. So what I do instead is I click this little square with an outward arrow here, and that opens this other pop-up here. And this is a fairly blank rubric, but I just like that this gives me more of a view, and I can do this and sort of, kind of push this away for a second if I want to sort of focus more on the whole view of the assignment, or I can bring it back up. But again, like I said, some people might really like this view here. It all depends on what's efficient for you.
Now what happens, Mike, when you open up Notepad? Do you want to demonstrate that?
Yeah, sure. So when I open up Notepad, let's see if I can show my taskbar. I'm in a different monitor right now, but just kind of comes over like this. And so I'm going to kind of resize my windows here so I can have, that right there. And I'll have this right here. And I just kind of bounce back and forth between the three of these windows.
Oh,
So I might say, I might be reading this and find, okay, I really like this. So I'll copy this and I'll put it here. Because maybe later in here, I might want to add feedback. I especially do this sort of thing in discussions because I don't have the ability in a discussion to annotate the way I can here. But that's just a little trick that might work well for you. Those of you who are also here, do you have any who have taught before? Olga, do you have any tips to share for your process for grading with rubrics?
This particular rubric that you're showing as an example, or showed as an example, did not have descriptions of each level. So in other cases, when it is present there, so that's helpful to use as an anchor. But overall, I think the process really depends on how well the work is done. It's really, really easy to grade with minimal feedback when the student has put the effort in. And it does become much more of a challenge if you end up providing a ton of feedback. So I actually like that suggestion that you put forth earlier, that if the work is really subpar, just send it back and see if the student is willing to redo it with more or less with general feedback of which points to address. And then if they still don't do it, then I guess you sort of stuck with providing more detailed feedback on why you deducted a lot of points.
Right.
Olga, the only problem with that is the classes run so quickly through. Most of my students do their work the last day of a week.
Yep.
By the time I get it, I think it would be better for some students to send it back to them and have them take a late penalty job.
Yep.
I think that's what I would have to do with my students, because most of them don't send the stuff in advance.
Yep, I've had to do that, Ivan, where the due date has passed, right? And I'm grading it and I realize it's missing something really important. And rather than giving them a 50, I'll turn it back and they can revise, and then maybe they can get up to an 80, because they're losing a little bit because of the late policy, but they're actually meeting the requirements of the whole assignment.
Of course, the only thing you can't do that with is discussions, because once they're beyond the due date, I don't even correct them.
Right. Yeah. It depends on the situation. Yeah.
I think, Ivan, you're also bringing up a very valid point about the purpose of the rubric. Is this assessment summative, and that's what you're doing by grading and using the performance levels? Or is it more forward-looking, like in case of discussions? If what you're finding, or if the comment is, well, your feedback was not, you did not use any critical thinking in your responses to peers, then that sort of feedback, even though you're not going to give that student a second chance on this discussion, hopefully going forward, that's what they will learn from this grade.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's an art. It's not.
yeah, over an 8-week class, you would hope that they would get the message, but sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But you're right, Olga. It does. I try to be a little bit more. Let's see. I spend a little bit more time on the discussions in the early weeks of the class to get the students onto the right track. And sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't.
All right, well, we are just about out of time. And I didn't quite get to all the topics. There was one more on video feedback that we might have touched on, but if you're interested, we could always meet again for a one-on-one. Like if you wanted a little bit more like sort of tutoring on how to juggle applications like I showed, we'd be happy to meet with you for that. All right, everybody. Well, that's a wrap for today. So thank you so much for coming.